Welcome to today's Explainer. We've got an absolutely incredible journey ahead of us. We are taking 400 years of sprawling, complex global history and condensing it down into one structured chronological timeline. We're going to trace the very foundations of the British Empire, follow its unparalleled expansion, and then examine its rapid dissolution. Together, we'll connect the dots across 4 centuries to see exactly how a small island nation managed to evolve into a massive global superpower. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this because the historical data here is absolutely staggering. Think about this. Today, there are just 14 overseas territories left where the British government holds power. Places like Gibraltar, or the Falkland Islands. But if we rewind a little over a century ago to the absolute zenith of its territorial control, the British Empire encompassed 1 full quarter of the entire globe's landmass, and it ruled over nearly a third of the world's population. I mean, it literally was the empire on which the sun never set.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We'll kick things off with the origins of the empire, move into expansion and revolution, explore the imperial century, examine zenith and global conflict, and finally wrap up with the wind of change. Section 1. Origins of the empire, from early ambitions to joint stock companies. The actual foundations for this massive global reach were laid down back in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. That's when Queen Elizabeth I started issuing these trading and exploration commissions to English adventurers, guys like Sir Francis Drake. But look, early colonization was incredibly dangerous. Take the very first English colony in North America, set up at Roanoke Island in 1585. It was a dramatic failure. The colonists just mysteriously disappeared without a trace. So because of disastrous setbacks like that, Elizabeth completely shifted her strategy. Instead, she started granting royal charters to joint stock companies. Enterprises like the Levant Company in 1592, and of course the incredibly famous East India Company in 1600, were given these powerful monopolies to develop overseas trade. This essentially outsourced the massive risk of empire building to corporate shareholders. Now, when King James of Scotland inherited the English throne and united the crowns, he kept building on this huge overseas ambition. And to govern these new expansions, he used 3 very distinct structures. First, you had crown colonies, which were ruled directly by a royally appointed governor. Then, charter colonies, ruled under a corporate charter, which actually gave colonists a bit more political liberty. And finally, proprietary colonies, which were unique commercial enterprises run by an individual on behalf of shareholders. This highly organized structure, combined with the blueprint established by the plantation of Ulster in Ireland, where Scottish and English settlers were systematically transported, really set the administrative stage for the New World. Moving on to Section 2, Expansion and Revolution, Union, Trade, and the First Major Loss. The 1600s and 1700s were totally defined by massive territorial and mercantile expansion, but they were also a time of intense internal and external conflict that completely reshaped the home nations. You can really clearly see the contrasting fortunes of England and Scotland during this era. England was vastly developing its trading networks in Africa and the East Indies. A critical and very dark piece of this was the creation of the Royal African Company in 1660, which led England to become the major player in the brutal yet highly lucrative transatlantic slave trade. Scotland, on the other hand, tried a completely different route with the 1698 Darien Scheme. They tried to set up a colony in Panama to control overland trade. Well, it was a catastrophic failure. Disease, food shortages, Spanish attacks. It was a disaster. And because the Scottish public had invested so heavily, that one failure wiped out almost a fifth of all the wealth in Scotland at the time. So the really crucial point here is understanding the direct cause and effect relationship of that financial disaster. Plunged into a massive crisis by the Darien Scheme, many in Scotland realized their best chance at survival and future prosperity was to share in England's successful colonial enterprise. This economic necessity directly triggered the 1707 Acts of Union, tying the independent parliaments of England and Scotland into one single kingdom named Great Britain. Let's move along and see how this builds a truly global footprint. Operating now as a united Great Britain, the 18th century saw exponential territorial conquests, largely at the expense of their French and Spanish rivals. First, Britain gains Newfoundland and Gibraltar in 1714. Then, by 1757, the East India Company's private armies won the Battle of Plassey, seizing control of Bengal. In 1759, Britain captured Quebec, essentially shutting down French colonial efforts in North America. And finally, the 1763 Treaty of Paris ceded a slew of incredibly valuable Caribbean islands to Britain.
They had officially become the dominant maritime power of the age.
But, as you might expect, this rapid growth eventually hit a major roadblock. Britain was heavily taxing its overseas colonies to fund all these wars, yet they afforded those colonists zero representation in Parliament. That dynamic, taxation without representation, led straight to the American Revolution in 1776. After an 8-year war, Britain was defeated, formally recognizing the independent United States of America in 1783, which really forces us to ask a crucial question. Where does a massive, expanding empire look after losing its most famous 13 colonies?
That brings us to Section 3, the Imperial Century, pivoting to the Pacific, Asia, and Africa. This new era, spanning from 1815 right up to 1914, was completely underpinned by uncontested naval dominance after they defeated the French fleet at the 1805 Battle of Trafalgar. And this brilliantly illustrates how an empire adapts. With the American colonies gone, Britain urgently needed a new destination for its convicts. So they established a penal settlement in New South Wales, Australia, in 1788. They also began relying heavily on the recent explorations of Captain James Cook, who had mapped New Zealand and the eastern coast of Australia back in the 1770s. At the exact same time, British mercantile interests pushed deep into the North Pacific, opening up a highly profitable fur trade. The focus had definitively shifted eastward. Now, during this same eastward expansion, some really significant legal and social shifts were happening internally. As the Industrial Revolution took hold, merchants back in Britain shifted their focus toward producing goods at home rather than relying on goods produced by slave labor in Caribbean plantations. This huge economic shift, combined with intense political pressure from abolitionist groups, actually forced the government to abolish the slave trade across the empire in 1807. However, and it's a critical historical distinction to make, it took another 27 full years before the institution of slavery itself was formally abolished in 1834. Now, what's really interesting here is the dramatic shift in how India was governed. For decades, the British East India Company had effectively seized control over much of the Indian subcontinent all on its own. But in 1857, local troops violently rebelled against their British commanders in the Sepoy Rebellion. Once the hostilities ended, the British government realized the corporate East India Company just couldn't administer the region effectively anymore. So what did they do? They dissolved the company entirely. By 1858, India was brought under direct rule by the British state. It became so immensely valuable to the imperial economy that it was universally referred to as the jewel in the crown. Section 4. Zenith and Global Conflict, the Scramble and the World Wars. To maintain its position at the top in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, literally reaching its absolute territorial zenith, Britain had to strategically outmaneuver emerging rival empires. It's like a giant geopolitical chess match. First, Britain engaged in the Crimean War in the 1850s specifically to stop the Russian Empire from expanding into the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Next, when the Suez Canal opened in 1869, linking the Mediterranean directly to the Indian Ocean, it became vitally important for British trade routes. To ensure that passage was perfectly secure, Britain took the massive step of militarily occupying Egypt in 1882. So, to manage this increasingly vast and complex global puzzle, Britain leveraged some incredible new technology. In 1902, they completed the All-Red Line. This was an electrical telegraph network that allowed London to communicate directly and instantly with all of its overseas colonies. I mean, think about that. It was a staggering technological achievement that effectively shrunk the globe, centralized British control, and totally solidified their role as the global policeman. But of course, that control would be violently tested with the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. An astounding 2.5 million men from Britain's dominions and colonies, including Canada, India, Australia, and New Zealand, served in the war. Britain relied immensely on its empire, not just for importing food and resources, but absolutely crucially for this military support. The empire won the war, yes, but the cost in human lives and resources was just devastating. Which brings us to Section 5, the Wind of Change, Bankruptcy and Decolonization. Despite being victorious in 2 world wars, the sheer economic toll left Britain fundamentally altered. It's a case of historic whiplash, really. In 1921, right in the aftermath of World War I, Britain actually annexed defeated territories, meaning the empire hit its absolute peak territorial size. Yet, just 2.5 decades later, by 1945, right after World War II, Britain emerged entirely bankrupt.
They were totally overstretched and simply no longer in an economic or military position to support an empire full of colonies that were understandably increasingly demanding their own independence. This rapid dissolution became known historically as the Wind of Change. Gradually, throughout the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, the vast majority of the colonies and dominions of the empire were formally granted their political independence. It was a stunningly swift end to nearly 400 years of global colonial history. Now, while those independence movements spanned a few decades, a lot of historians point to 1997 as the final, definitive close of the chapter. In 1997, Britain formally handed control of Hong Kong back to China. It's widely considered the most symbolic representation that the sun had finally, truly set on the British Empire. So, why does all of this history actually matter to us today? Well, because the legacy of those 400 years is totally baked into the very fabric of our modern world. Just think about it. English remains the most widely spoken language on Earth. Many former colonies maintain ties through a political association called the Commonwealth. There are still 14 overseas territories under British governance today. And perhaps most importantly, modern Britain itself is a multicultural microcosm of the former empire. It's home to people of almost every nationality and culture that were once under British rule. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought. We've seen how centuries of ambition, trade, conflict, and technology completely connected the globe. But if modern Britain is truly a microcosm of its former territories, how will the cultural and demographic legacy of this 400-year empire continue to shape our interconnected global future? It's a really fascinating question to reflect on as you continue learning. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey through history. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and I'll see you in the next explainer.